I'm Bob Rindy, and I had a very long career with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, really starting in 1981, although officially 1983, because for a couple of years I was part of a team of hired contractors, which is what we were called, to review a very large number of comprehensive plans that had been submitted to the department for acknowledgement. Prior to that, let's see, I graduated from my undergraduate degree in 1974 from University of California at Berkeley, and I began, at the time, I was hoping to be an urban planner, even though my degree wasn't necessarily in planning. I went to work for the city of Pleasant Hill, California, and the planning department, and I worked for 4 years with the city in doing a large variety of things. I went back to graduate school in 1978. That's really the first time that I came to Oregon. So I arrived in Oregon in the summer of 1978, and for the University of Oregon's Master of Urban Planning degree, or Urban and Regional Planning is what they called it then. I learned about the state land use planning program as part of that program in the introductory courses. I took an internship with the Lane County Housing Authority to help a person, M.A. Leonard was her name, who was trying to find sites for government-assisted housing in the small cities of Lane County. So I had a number of field trips to small cities as we were trying to find sites. So that was sort of my introduction to housing. I had done very little sort of housing work for the city of Pleasant Hill. I worked on design review and airport planning and a bunch of other issues. So this was an introduction to housing for me. I ended up getting an internship with Thousand Friends of Oregon. So for that summer of, the next summer was 79, those 3 months I lived in Portland and came in to the Thousand Friends office on 3rd Street, was it, the Deacon building, every day. Worked under Mark Greenfield. Thousand Friends had hired Mark to focus on Goal 10, and I was his intern. In that capacity, I began reviewing comprehensive plans that had been submitted to the department so that the Thousand Friends could weigh in with a letter of comment on each one with regard to Goal 10. At the end of that summer, of course, I went back to the University of Oregon for the second year of the graduate program. That was, what, 79? And right away, Bob Clay was manager of what was called the Housing Division at the time. The state of Oregon, it's now the Department of Housing and Community Services, but back then it was a division of DAS. Bob said, hey, I'd like you to continue doing the work you were doing for Thousand Friends, but on behalf of the Housing Department on a part-time basis while you continue school. So I had a paid summer internship with the Housing Division, and I worked on through the winter, and I can't remember whether I worked all the way to the spring term. I think I probably did. At the end of my coursework, I still was working on a senior project. I went to a job fair and ended up getting a job with the city of Irvine, California. And it seemed like it was sort of exciting. I was going to do a housing element for them. Went down there, moved my family down there. I'll just say briefly, there were several reasons why I wasn't very satisfied with that. Didn't really want to live there anymore once I got used to being there. 6 months later, I was hired back by, this time by the department for this big ramp up they were doing to review comprehensive plans. And so I came back to Oregon, and that was 1981. January of '81, began reviewing these plans. Now there's a large team of people that they were bringing on because they had a sort of a backlog. The goals had been adopted in '74. I wasn't part of that. There had been various jurisdictions that had finished the work required by the state goals to turn in for state review a comprehensive plan, but not very many, a few, and I don't remember the numbers. But the state had this team of people that they then handed the plans off to, and each contractor was required to turn in a report which would go to LCDC recommending that the plan either be acknowledged or what we called continued. In other words, acknowledgement was denied. And that was a lot of work. It was a lot of work. My focus was to be the housing goal and the urban growth boundary goal. In the office, you had a lot of people who were looking just at goal 5 or just at goal 3 and all those plans. So it was a team of people that kind of packed into an office. Now, right then, and I was working right alongside Greg Winterroad, the agency was finishing up the adoption of administrative rules on Goal 10, what's Division 8, Division 7 for Metro, and right on the heels, the statewide rules. And simultaneously, there was a big push to put a lot of Goal 10 in statute, and that also occurred in 1981, I believe. Mm-hmm. So let's see, how do I put this in context? The goal was pretty broad, and policy in those days was set by interpreting the goal, and that was largely the role of LCDC. And so every meeting they would have, once a month or once every 2 months, they'd meet, and reports would come in of the reviews of the comprehensive plans that had been turned into the state. And there would be, as part of those reports, a section on Goal 10. How did Tualatin do with their comprehensive plan in meeting Goal 10? And that reviewer's job was to write that report, to examine the plan, work usually with what we call field reps. Now they're called regional reps, but they were field reps, and the cities, and get this report in order, looking at the goal, looking at the plan, interpreting the words on the page, but also, of course, with an awareness of many decisions that LCDC started making in '79, really interpreting that goal and starting to put some meat on the bones of this really broad standard of Goal 10. What does it mean to have a plan that provides for the housing needs for 20 years? What does an inventory of buildable land mean? All these terms were slowly starting to become interpreted through a series of LCDC decisions looking at individual plans. So every plan that I looked at, or a number of other people, the propensity of the review staff was to try to, of course, reflect previous decisions that had been made by LCDC interpreting these terms, but also to look at the unique circumstances that were there for every single plan and write these reports. That's how housing policy was developed, to the extent that there were a lot of terminology issues, shall we say, or certainly interpretation issues for what were we trying to do. Some of that was just lore to a person like myself coming in 1981 to work for the department. Some of it I already knew because of my work with the Housing Division and Thousand Friends, and some of it was even prior to that. But we were essentially, in the mix of making housing policy that was best described as an interpretation of what had been asserted in 1974, and that maybe in many cases they thought the policy they were writing down was what they wanted, but in some cases not.
Based on your practice experience, what you learned in school at the time, what was your sense, you and your colleagues, about what this goal was intended to accomplish? What were the problems that it was aiming to solve? What was the discourse like about what are we doing here?
Right. So that discourse was both public and in the sense that it was within the department, of course, was more confined, but it was it was pretty well understood that this whole Goal 10 thing had grown out of a movement in the late 60s and early 70s nationwide about exclusionary zoning, about trying to make sure that that housing was built to provide for people of all incomes, you know, just a lot of things that really happened before my time that ended up in the development of the goals. And I presume you're going to interview somebody or many who will tell you about that goal. I can't tell you about all those issues, but it was pretty clear in the way that goal was written that our role very interlaced with urban growth boundaries, that for each city that provided an urban growth boundary, and all cities had to do that, 20-year supply of land except for the metro area where you had 27 cities and counties within that boundary, that within that boundary there would be enough land that was designated for a variety of housing types, densities, to provide, to allow, and we used this word a lot in talking to cities at the time as we would look at their plan. The Goal 10 wants to make sure that cities allow for the market to work, for housing to be built for a variety of income levels and a variety of types and densities. The city itself was never tasked with doing something to make sure you have to make sure that some housing gets developed. They just had to provide the opportunity through zoning and through the plan for that to happen. Well, the conversation was about, boy, that's a pretty tall order for the state to step into each city's plan and look at it and say, that plan does a good job of allowing what the needs are for that city over the next 20 years. And so a lot of the conversation was, well, how does that get done? How do we do that? Well, we sort of start off, it really is an accounting exercise, I should say. In fact, more than once there were jokes made about the plan reviewers with their green visors. We were accountants. We were looking at the tally sheets. Here's the land that the city has provided in its urban growth boundary, 20-year supply. Here's how much of it is residential. In the residential land, how many housing units reasonably would be built? These were all forecasts and projections by the cities. We could do them and we would do them as well, sort of to double check the math. This is what percentage of that is multifamily? Do they allow manufactured housing? Manufactured housing was a huge issue in the 80s for this goal. Not so much today, but back then. What were the zoning code requirements for that housing? The city of St. Helens decision, I believe, was a '79 precedent set by LCDC in reviewing their plan, and it had really large implications, because that's where LCDC said, in order to allow the opportunity for affordable housing, that term wasn't used so much as for a variety of types and densities of housing, the approval standards that the city used must be clear and objective and not have the effect of precluding the housing type. So we would look at the zoning code for manufactured housing or for multifamily housing and for single family housing, because it was pretty much the practice in cities, and certainly in my experience working with the city of Pleasant Hill in California, and probably suburban jurisdictions such as that, was a sort of a, we'll know it when we see it. So development applications for housing come into the planning department for review in the building department, and standards are written so that there's really a lot of leeway for the staff, for the planning commission, city council, to evaluate that application and allow it, or to say, no, you can't build this, or you can't have new permits unless you reduce the density, or make everything prettier by putting sloped roofs, or just a whole variety of things that would come up in the review process that weren't clearly stated in the codes. And so the general notion of the St. Helens policy, which was reflected in the new rules in '81 and in the statute, was that every city's standards had to be clear and objective. Well, we took a lot of time looking at standards and arguing about that. Cities would come in with a plan map that showed, maybe it would show that these areas around here are for multifamily housing, but when you look at the zoning code, they weren't zoned for that. They were just zoned to broad residential. And the city would say, well, we're going to upzone it piece by piece. Well, what are your standards? When the developer comes in and asks for that, and you'd find, well, their standards are very loosey-goosey, so there really wasn't any certainty for a developer. So a lot of this grew out of conversations with the home builders. The home builders wanted to have more certainty, and the notion was a developer should be able to come into a city hall with a permit application and know in advance all those gory details, because they were very expensive to change things. And there was a lot of inertia on the part of cities not to do that, either because that's the way they've been doing things for years, or it wasn't, certainly the conversation developed into, well, this is hard. City planners would be very clear to the state that if we're going to write a zoning code that's clear and objective, you know, that's difficult to do. Do we have to write down everything? If you have to hide your trash containers, we have to write that in the code in a way that's clear and objective. What if we want to have a little more flexibility? That was a big debate between the state, between cities and the home builders and the state. And interestingly, I think this is one of the principal issues where you definitely have both environmental and land use planning organizations such as Thousand Friends and state home builders on the same page, allied, closely allied with each other in trying to assert a very strong interpretation of that St. Helens policy. Not only that policy, but the general policy of Goal 10 that cities would provide an adequate supply for 20 years. You know, it's not a secret that a lot of suburban communities were resistant to higher density housing, and it's the neighbors that are resistant. It's maybe certain city council members or just planners in the office, resistant to manufactured housing, resistant to the notion that applications would come in and would have to be approved because they met a code and they didn't really have any ability to look at each one and come up with standards, because the only way they'd be able to do that is if the standards were highly subjective, and that's what we wouldn't allow. So you had a lot of contentious debate in that acknowledgement process for all, I don't even remember the numbers anymore, but all the cities had to ultimately go through that. And usually cities would go through it in at least 2 steps. Cities would come in, their plan would be, they would submit their plan to the department, their plan would be evaluated, they would go up in front of LCDC, and the staff would usually recommend that there were certain goals that the city didn't meet. And Goal 10 was often on that list. And in order to streamline this process, which was also a big debate at the time, we were taking too long, cities couldn't get through the acknowledgement process, they were required to get through it really by the initial legislation in 2 years, but that was really a joke. It took a much longer time. And so the review of the initial review would result in a series of what we called in order to comply statements. So under Goal 10, it would say, in order to comply with Goal 10, please bring your plan back. And at that time, revise your zoning ordinance as follows. Eliminate section 12 that's just too subjective, or whatever it would be. These would be very succinct statements about what work the city had to do. So you had cities in various stages of acknowledgement, developing their plan, having brought it in or brought it in for the first time, or maybe this was their second or even their third try to get acknowledgement. And all of that was going on in an environment of the land use program was still very hotly in contention. Was it 1981? That was the third ballot measure to try 82 to try to get rid of the program. So that was the environment. The office environment was, I think, unique in that, maybe not unique, but unusual for state agencies. A large team of generally younger, very committed individuals into making this land use program work. A lot of camaraderie, and part of that, of course, being we were under fire. You know, there was a lot of folks out there trying to get rid of the state land use program, and certainly a lot of opposition to certain policies that were difficult politically for local governments to implement. and goal 10 was one of those. So, you know, the result of all of that was that probably plans and the success of plans to meet goal 10, because, you know, in that period of time, which probably encompassed 6-7 years, where all those plans, all these cities' plans in the state came in for acknowledgement, you could have had anywhere from, you know, 5 to 10 different reviewers trying to look at those plans, interpret these goals. They all had a little bit of different ideas, and it was a big task, so nobody was, you know, watching everything that a reviewer did. Ultimately, the reviewer's work would go up to managers, Dale Blanton, Greg Winterode. I have to mention some names that I hope you will interview, and then up to LCDC. So we, you know, it was a process of gathering a lot of information, distilling it, and bringing to LCDC a very succinct set of, here's how this city did in meeting this goal. Here's where they didn't meet the goal. Here's what they need to do to meet the goal, and then a schedule for them to meet the goal, change the plan, come back to LCDC and get that approved. That was the nature of that exercise. So I'll stop there and see if you can focus me on what you need to know based on that little introduction.
We'll do one point. So there was goal 10 in Oregon, and then there was the Mount Laurel Supreme Court cases in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Were people talking about that, making comparisons between what we're doing here in Oregon and what the New Jersey Supreme Court did in the Mount Laurel cases?
You know, that came up over the years. I think probably that conversation, remind me when the Mount Laurel decision was.
75,
Yeah.
and then it comes back again because not much happens by way of implementation.
Right.
So the Supreme Court comes
You know,
back in the 80s.
a lot of that, I think, was probably more important discussion in the development of the goal, the development of the initial interpretations of the goal, you know, the sort of setting the stage. Really, I think the first comprehensive plan came in 79. You'll have to check my math on that. I mean, here you had the goals done in 74, but you finally started getting plans in 79.
Right.
What were cities doing? Well, you know, large cities had, you know, sophisticated staff trying to look closely at these goals and revamp their plan. Or a lot of cities took the attitude of, our plan already met these goals. We certainly had some of that, and I would say City of Salem was one that I worked on, where we already have a urban growth boundary, we had all this stuff, we already meet the goals. Whereas you have other cities, many, who are saying, well, this is all kinds of new stuff, we're going to have to redo our planning. So you have a lot of local planning exercises going on. There was a lot of federal money coming in, and I don't remember how much state money. The state was funding regional coordinators at the county level to help with planning.
Right.
A lot of 701 grants came in, and cities would use those to hire consultants who might, you know, have 10 cities they were working on. Pulling zoning ordinances out of the ether, and we didn't have the internet in those days, but, you know, all kinds of different zoning ordinances and planning type things being put together and submitted to LCDC, and it really didn't get rolling until about 78, 79, and really ramped up by 81, 82 when I was officially at the state. I think anything that Mount Laurel and a lot of those other decisions would have influenced would have been already done by 79. And I hope that you get some answers to that as you interview people who were developing the policy early on. Certainly Greg Winterode and some others.
We've talked to Greg. Yeah. Okay. Plans are acknowledged. Your sense of implementation?
Well, you know, so it was a long process to just get through the acknowledgement phase, but at the same time, everybody was using their plan, using in the sense that development was, you had various housing booms, you know, throughout the 80s. You had a lot of development, and even when plans weren't acknowledged, cities were reviewing development applications and were developing. So Goal 10 was one of those things that was really important after a city got approved, but
right.
In some cases, cities might not have been acknowledged until 83, 84, even 85. But all that time, they were using their plan, they had to apply the goal locally. So if the city wasn't acknowledged, and this was a lot of the incentive to meet the goals, then each decision had to be accompanied by findings against the goal. So every exercise of approving plan amendments or development applications involved applying the goal. I don't think the agency had a robust staff to look at all those application decisions. Now we're into the work of the field reps and staff who was reviewing things that were coming to the department. And it was only over the period of the 80s that we really got in place the architecture for cities to send all their decisions for the state to look at. And there certainly were, we were seeing the implementation, but I think it's fair to say that what rose to the top of those discussions were things that were contentious, and often from a local argument. Maybe the home builders were very mad at a city for turning down a particular development and using some approval standards that weren't clear. Or, of course, giant battles over is there enough land? Can we add land? When you talk Goal 10, it's really hard to escape also talking about Goal 14 because they were so intermeshed. But all of those arguments, they would sort of filter up to the state in a few cases to involve a city's implementing of its plan. But I don't know that we even today have data looking back to say, here's all the decisions that were made where Goal 10 findings were used and all the decisions made after we acknowledged plans. And here's generally how it worked. Boy, that would be a tough project to figure out. And that data wasn't readily available to us. Our job was to look at the plans and then we had field reps who were looking at implementation. But typically, I became the housing and urbanization specialist in '83, and I worked for about 2 or 3 years in that role, just reviewing plans. But then I became a regional rep for the Willamette Valley, mid-Willamette Valley, and I had a large number of jurisdictions, I don't even remember the number, that I was looking at, watching day to day, so to speak, tasked with helping them where the state program was involved. Some of them were counties. Many of the issues that they were dealing with weren't Goal 10, some were. And so as a field rep, you would pay attention to implementation decisions. And I think by and large, those cities that had an acknowledged plan and had done a fairly good job of meeting Goal 10 would find that they'd still be in arguments locally, publicly, about development applications for housing as developers came in and wanted to infill or increase the density or build manufactured housing or build apartments or condominiums or what have you. I mean, all of those implementation decisions after acknowledgement would generally be between the lawyers, the developers, and the cities, and the state only if there was some interpretive issue regarding Goal 10. And certainly the state had the authority and exercised it of saying, we're going to step in on this one and be part of that local discussion. This is a pretty obvious violation of Goal 10, or this is a real important Goal 10 policy issue that's not quite worked out yet that we want to be at the table with. But implementation was much lower in terms of our attention than reviewing the plans, amendments to those plans. And we started getting into peer review, of course, in the late 80s, where cities were coming back with revised plans and had a whole program to revise them, and there was that whole debate going on. I hope that answered your question.
No, that's very important. Yeah. If I can go back to an earlier period just briefly. So you're working for Mark Greenfield.
Yes, with 1,000 Friends in the summer of, was that 79?
Right, and so that's just when the Columbia Region Association of Governments is struggling to adopt an urban growth boundary for the region. And Mark is, of course, watchdogging that for 1,000 Friends. Bob Stacy is also involved heavily. And it's about how much buildable land do we need inside this boundary
Exactly.
to accommodate the 20-year forecast of population growth?
Right.
What are your memories about?
Well, so
being
one thing
there?
that's just jumped into my brain, there's some other memories I could probably dredge up, but was Bob Stacy sitting at his desk and Mark and I looking at this. What he had was a drawing, I think got it from San Francisco, but I'm not sure. It was a section drawing, you know, if you see it's a side view of a street that was quite steep and all the buildings along the street. And Bob Stacy was saying, look at how dense this is, and this is more than 25% slope. So there was a big argument going on that, well, if land is 25% slope or more, it's not buildable. And that was a debate in Metro. It was a huge debate because it had vast implications for how large the UGB was, because they had to have a 20-year supply in the UGB for housing, and if all this land that was sloped was unbuildable, then that meant a lot of farmland would be put in the boundary. Those are the kinds of things we were talking about. A lot of that was really in the realm of let's interpret. You know, we've got at that time, we didn't have the rule or even the statute. You just had a goal 10 declaring that, and goal 14, that the UGB, the Metro, what we now call the Metro UGB, the CRAD one at the time, was going to include a 20-year supply of buildable land. Well, what's buildable? So those are the kinds of debates, policy debates, that were crucial, really, policy debates that were going on about just looking at terms on the page of this magical document that had come out in '74 that was called Goal 10, that had a lot of terminology you had to interpret. The city had to I can't remember the words now because it's the benefit of a year out of the department as I start to forget all the details, but there are things in Goal 10 that basically task cities with looking 20 years ahead and determining what kind of housing needs do they have, how many people are coming to the city, and of course we've had the long, you and I just talked about the population, well, we didn't have any of that then. How do you forecast population? No detailed policies on that. How does CRAG decide what the average density is in the region for housing? How much multifamily land? They ultimately made some decisions based on that very contentious argument in '79 for that boundary that were key to later policy discussions. For example, in Metro, in the Portland boundary, the prediction was that 50% of the housing in the future was going to be attached housing of some sort. And so, okay, every city in the metro area has to allow 50%. So here you had a regional agency's decision, which was nothing but a forecast that they made as to sort of get out of that whole debate, that became a key policy for metro jurisdictions for the next still a policy. So some of that was going on in the office. A lot of what was going on was we were starting to see a large number of plans for the metro area. Beaverton was a review I worked on, and so for the first time, really, we were sort of focusing in on words in Goal 10 that had enough subjectivity to them that you could interpret them multiple ways. We would like to arrive at a common interpretation of these terms. How do you do a regional forecast? How does a city show through findings as part of their plan that they've looked at what the regional forecast is for the density of multifamily housing, and they're commensurate with that, or they've looked at the regional forecast for how much density there is likely to be built in the next 20 years given the market. They've looked at their supply. Many cities would forecast their future needs based on what was already there. So the city would do an inventory and they'd say, here's the housing and of course this was nice in the Portland area because you had the exact rules that came out of the CRAG decision. 50%, 6, 8, 10 density. Those are two big decisions that resulted in 1981 in the Division 7 Goal 10 housing rules for metro areas. For the rest of the state, we didn't have any of that. And we were certainly seeing plans from the rest of the state and trying to determine, well, this city came in, and maybe it's a big city, maybe it's a small city, and they showed us their work and their forecast for housing needs for the next 20 years, and how do we decide what the heck that means. How do we know whether they did a good job, a lousy job, a great job, something we should, you know, laud them for, or something we should send back? And none of that was worked out, certainly in '79 when I was working with Mark. We had ideas about it. It had certainly been under discussion a long time, and it would get incorporated into letters we sent. And of course the department was simultaneously working on those issues. And so there was a coalesce, the thinking would all coalesce into a meeting at LCDC for a particular jurisdiction, say St. Helens, and issues would flow out of that, and they would be interpretive issues. That was sort of the atmosphere in the summer of '79. A different atmosphere by the time you get to '81, '82, and you've got rules in place and a statute that sort of reflects a lot of the decisions that had been made earlier. So the task had changed, and that early work was really crucial in developing what became the rules and the statute. And the statute really, and the rule, were written to reflect what had started to emerge as interpretations and practices of interpreting Goal 10 in the run-up between '74 and '81 when they were adopted. So it's not like they just came out of the blue and all of a sudden you had this
Right.
Division 7, Division 8 housing rules statewide, and the legislature adopting pretty clearly what's the St. Helen policy and the Goal 10 policy into law. That was a reflection of what we thought was already there.
Right.
And this is a matter of just sort of freezing it into officialdom, into the law and into rules. So all that policy was developed 79, 80, sometime in there. Maybe some earlier, before I was a part of the team.
How about relations between state agencies? So you've already mentioned the State Housing Agency, but transportation, economic development, they're all obviously related to housing. So.
Yeah, and that's quite an interesting story, I think. Some of those agents, you know, there's so many goals, and so the relations between Department of Transportation and DLCD, someone else will have to tell you about all those, because I wasn't tracking all of that then. But, you know, the land use program in 1981, when I started working with the state, and certainly in '79 with 1,000 Friends, was very controversial. And a lot of state agencies, I'm, you know, looking back, I'm not trying to accuse anybody of anything, but I think there was a general notion of don't touch this with a 10-foot pole. That's their big dogfight over there at that agency. But agencies are somewhat insular. You know, they've all got their task. The housing division, you know, it's a lot of a finance of affordable housing kind of agency, with dealing with federal grants and funding, and certainly a lot of inventory and a lot of other stuff. But they weren't they weren't tasked to in statute and in their laws to enforce Goal 10. That was our problem,
Right.
our problem, DLCD's problem.
Right.
And so I think it was pretty unprecedented for the housing agency to decide they were going to take a very active role in essentially, in many cases, actually opposing their sister agency. Because LCDC might look like, and when I say opposing, I mean they would look at all these plans just like the staff at DLCD was doing, just like 1,000 Friends. And you know, I did some of that work as an intern, and a lot of that work under Bob Clay. And then after me was Mary Holly, a classmate of mine who went on, became, you know, Bob Clay's replacement, and continued for several years looking at all those plans, and in doing so, arriving at conclusions about individual city plans that might be that this city doesn't meet Goal 10, or this city does. That might contradict what the agency had concluded in their own staff meetings. So you have this odd thing with state agencies not being on the same page, and with housing division being an outlier. Other agencies had a more hands-off approach, and again, I didn't work with all the agencies, so it's not fair for me to make those accusations. But I think it was, housing was probably an example of an agency that more so than others was sort of taking on a role they hadn't officially under law been assigned to, but that they somehow came to the conclusion they needed someone to look at these plans, and they were looking at them. in a way that maybe some other agencies weren't doing. And it generally, you don't, well, most states have a collection of state agencies, and they're trying to work together. And that's your turf over there. Here's our turf, and all of that. So it's kind of unusual to have two agencies sort of having a task that was mostly assigned to DLCD, and having the housing agency taking a strongly assertive position and doing a lot of work to help the agency. I mean, there was more plans than LCDC could look at. I mean, that's why we had this staff of people. I mean, the agency had this sort of, we sometimes talked about it as the pig and the snake. You had this huge glut of work to do, and so it was welcome anytime others would help in the review process to really scrutinize these plans and make sure they met Goal 10. Later, and I don't remember when this was, probably by the mid-'80s, Mary Holly had left, and the attention by the housing, eventually became the Housing and Community Development Department, subsided. And some of that, I think, was budget, and some of that was just getting staff members on who probably had a lot of other work to do and didn't want to double check all the plans for Goal 10. So you have this brief period in history where not only LCDC but the housing agency are closely examining land use plans. I don't know where that is today, but I carefully assert that I don't think that the housing agency is staffed to watch all the implementation decisions and to look at land use plans and zoning ordinances as they change, which they do continuously. Right. That's the LCD's job.
But yet, state agency plans are supposed to be consistent with acknowledged city and county land use plans.
Yeah, it's a part of the land use program that's probably not really well understood by the public. Is that the acknowledgement, which was a declaration by LCDC that a plan or a program or something meets the goals, also included state agencies. And the process of sort of understanding what this wonderful idea was in '74 and implementing it with state agency plans that would ultimately, what's in a state agency plan and program, what's the package? They submit this to LCDC as a big submittal, and then somebody will look at it and go through the motions so that ultimately LCDC, the commission, can say, okay, housing, your program is consistent with the goals. That was a long process and really didn't have much meat on the bones. And this is an interview you would have with Jim Knight until probably more the mid to late '80s, certainly not early on. But arguably, and there was probably a piece of that history that I think Dick Matthews, somebody should be on your list, would probably have more of a sense. Some of it took place before I got there. There was an early sort of, all those agency programs are consistent. There was a later, much bigger look and a set of rules and things. And so it's been really a long process that I don't think has ever really gelled into something that makes a huge difference. The ability of this very small, probably one of the smallest agencies in the state, to look at plans and programs for a giant agency, let's say Fish and Wildlife, and come out with a report to LCDC and have LCDC basically issue some sort of a statement that agency's program doesn't meet the goals and require that agency to change the goals. There's something about that thinking that's, it's a wonderful idea, but to carry that out in the environment of the legislature meeting every 2 years and giving them, having a lot of time on their agenda for, let's just say, Fish and Wildlife Department, huge agency, and for this little agency that, by the way, they came in and said we had to change this program. Well, that program's in law or in statute. How can you do that? It doesn't work very well. A lot of the coordination takes place with the governor's staff, getting agency directors and trying to get them all on the same page, rather than any sort of official acknowledgement. Official acknowledgement and all that work to get LCDC to declare a plan consistent with the goals or not consistent with the goals, it worked far better with cities and counties than it ever worked with state agencies. But like I say, in the midst of all of that, Housing Division did take a role. Of course, you had home builders looking at plans. The manufactured housing, what were they? At the time, they were the Manufactured Housing Dealers Association. They changed into something else. Don Miner, who's still around, you might want to interview Don Miner. I ran into him in the grocery store about 6 months ago. And
Really? Oh.
so he's around still. He's long stopped doing that work too, but he looked closely at every plan. He had 1,000 friends looking at it, housing divisions, the LCD staff, of course. You had manufactured home builders. You had home builders in general. So there was multiple parties with different points of view examining all of the city plans being submitted, in some cases county plans, against Goal 10, and all putting forth their interpretations and conclusions to LCDC to make some final decision, which would therefore often involve a little bit more peeling away of the onion for, well, what does it mean for a city to project their 20-year needs for housing that is commensurate with the incomes that they predict are going to be in their city for that 20 years. And it was a group effort. It wasn't just the LCD or just 1,000 friends or just home builders.
Right. So an overall sense of the effectiveness of the goal and its implementation?
Well, of course, we haven't had time to really get into all the various discussions of what went right and what went wrong. A lot of the argument over affordable housing involves, is there enough land? And uniquely in Oregon, don't we have an artificial constraint on land, which is the 20-year urban growth boundary? And, you know, that's a very contentious thing for me to make any statement, my own opinion about whether a 20-year urban growth boundary results in artificial constraints so significant that it's a big part of the housing crisis. You know, that housing costs in Oregon are much higher because of that. There's certainly a lot of people that have data and research of similar sized cities to Portland, let's just say, that don't have urban growth boundaries, and they might see the same trends. And so the argument is, well, it doesn't have that effect. A lot of small cities, in that first round of acknowledgements, sort of the late 70s, early 80s, many of the urban growth boundaries were very large. The whole interpretation of Goal 14 and what is a 20-year supply was also under development throughout those years, and very contentious. And the result was that there was a lot of land, but nevertheless, a lot of the argument about affordable housing sort of comes back to an argument about Goal 14 and urban growth boundaries. But an awful lot of that argument is also about what were cities doing. Cities are planning and zoning land. They're picking areas where they're going to allow single-family housing at what density, multifamily housing, high density, medium density, what have you. A lot of those local decisions really have a huge effect on housing supply. There are all kinds of different actors in that locally, and there are cities that have been for the last 20 years working very hard to see if they can make the process work locally so that they get development of, say, condos and attached housing as well as single family. And there are many cities, certainly the smaller ones, where the inertia from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the city I worked with in California, was we're a suburban community. We don't want anything but suburbs. We want really wide streets with really large lots. It's sort of a cliche now, but it was very much prevalent at the time. And so convincing cities to allow more density, to provide ordinances and land designated for other housing types was a big lift. I think the policy has had an effect. I think many cities today have zoning ordinances that allow higher density single family and more land for multifamily attached housing as a result of Goal 10 and the efforts of that acknowledgement process. But I don't know how you find those numbers and how you would prove that in the literature in an academic sense. I'm sure somebody smart enough can figure that out. I hope you're going to talk to Terry more.
Trying to locate him, yeah.
He's in Washington State now, but I can help you with that if you need be, but
Yes.
you know, I just mentioned him as an example of there's people that know how to research this sort of stuff, and so when we start asking the question, legitimate academic question of did we have an effect, what kind of effect, how much effect did all of this have, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's beyond my ability to answer. I was involved toward the end of my career in a very big effort to revise the Goal 14 rules, and that was probably the first time that you had an effort that was data-driven on what was going on at the local levels. What was going on, densities, what had been happening with building permits over the last 10, 20 years. A lot of data-driven policy work, not data-driven in 1981. I don't think, you know, BGRS, the Bureau of Government Research and Survey, there was some state agencies and federal, certainly, census and other things to help develop that policy, but it wasn't a robust data-driven exercise. And that meant that as we implemented it, I don't know that we were able to keep track of the successes and go back and say, well, here's the city of Tualatin's development patterns from 1970 to 1980, and here's the patterns from 80 to 85, and here's what happened after their acknowledged plan. I hope somebody's doing that work, but I don't know. I can't tell you we had a huge impact or none at all. I think it would seem to me, having been there at the center of that maelstrom, we had to have an impact. There are a large number of jurisdictions that changed their practices for development of housing as a result of Goal 10, being required to change their codes, their plans, their procedures to meet Goal 10, and as a result, today those cities have an environment where it's somewhat easier to build housing than it would have been if we hadn't done that. Does that mean that we have enough land certainly for, shall we just say, higher density housing? Medium density is something that's we're focusing on more and more. The metro area, they have a unique experience. Once you get outside of the metro area, where a vast number of cities statewide, you sort of have a different discussion about housing. Eugene and Corvallis have a certain discussion, in Salem, because they're bigger cities, and then you have a large number of smaller cities. And it's not the same discussion that you're having.
Right.
Do they have a shortage of land today? Many would say they do, many would say they don't. And I certainly, when I was a regional rep for the Willamette Valley for a number of years, and I went into more than one city where the planner just was right up front, is we don't want any multifamily in this town, we don't want any mobile homes. And it was overt. And so you got into that debate. And then there were a number of cities that said, no, we want to help. We want to work with you on meeting Goal 10. We want to bring affordable housing. So you really had a vast array of different attitudes politically for various cities. And I think where we had more effect was on those that we had to change the thinking. Those that on their own were really interested in making housing more affordable. I don't know, I suppose if I gave it some thought, that there's some things we did that really helped that along, hopefully, but it was, in many cases, we were holding hands with those jurisdictions to get through the process and have them, carry out their vision for making more affordable housing. And so a lot of the effect LCDC would have been on cities that didn't share that vision.
Right. So there's probably a sense of triage. There are those with some engagement from the state might turn around, do things differently. There are those that they're doing it themselves and they could use some help, but
right.
Nevertheless, they're doing stuff on their own. And then there are those that are beyond the pale and they're not going to change whatever we do.
I think that's probably what you'd find if you did all that research. My feeling is that it's really problematic as a housing policy for a state to assert in the way that they did in 1974 with Goal 10, that we are going to sort of play a parental role for city planning and force cities to do things that they on their own wouldn't want to do. And I'm probably not phrasing that very artfully, but that's kind of what Goal 10 did. And the notion that we can change their minds is, I think, a little bit too arrogant, because you can't. But you can look at what they did and say, it's not going to pass muster unless you allow single-family housing at 7 units per acre rather than 15,
right.
or rather than at 3, or whatever you had. So a lot of those big arguments didn't necessarily mean that that city went off after acknowledgement and had a different attitude about housing. They probably still, and this is, I don't know, not everybody by any means, said, well, we still don't want a lot of apartments in our town. I went into a meeting in the city of Silverton, probably around 1985, and they were 86, somewhere in there. They were trying to come in for the second round of acknowledgement and get through Goal 10. And I sat in a very contentious meeting where the argument was, are you guys going to come around and meet the goal and provide some land that's just zoned for attached housing, because you really don't have any, or hardly any. New city manager stood up in the room and said, I just moved here, I just got this job 3 months ago, I couldn't find a place to stay. I had to commute. There's no rental housing in this town. I thought, boy, that's a brave move by a new city manager, but it's probably true, was probably true at certain time periods for many cities, that there wasn't any housing choice. If you wanted to be a renter and you only had this much money,
right.
You had to go next door where housing was cheaper.
Right.
Over there, Mount Angel or wherever it is, and commute. Right now, you have that still throughout the state, where you've got really tight UGBs, like in Ashland. You can't get any rental housing. You have to go rent housing in the neighboring community and commute every day. So, I don't know that things are a whole lot different today, and you could argue, therefore, we haven't had an effect. But I think LCDC's Goal 10 did result in a large amount of land statewide being zoned to allow higher density single family, more multifamily of various densities, and certainly the manufactured housing. The manufactured housing thing was a big argument in the early 80s, but ultimately that association was successful in getting a statute in that said everywhere you allow single family, you have to allow a manufactured home. That was a huge success on their part, and it sort of took a big argument off the table. And then all of a sudden the industry collapsed, nobody's building manufactured housing, and so the whole thing went away. So, yeah, I don't know, roundabout answer, but I think we've had a success. I think there was a good success from Goal 10, but maybe not to the amount that was envisioned. And today's problems about affordable housing probably require a lot of advancement of that state policy and some new ideas, rather than just relying on this whole notion that was very powerful in 1980, but maybe not as powerful today.
Okay, well, that was basically the last area I'd hope you'd cover. How's the housing issue changed from then to now? Your thoughts about the likely future of the housing issue and the role of Goal 10?
Well, I guess it's changed, but in the sense that we're in a whole different market today, and there was up until 2008 and the crash, there was a lot of people were able to buy a single-family home, or some other sort of home ownership was a lot easier to achieve with lending practices, for example. The housing problem has changed a lot nowadays because of lending practices. Nothing we can touch at the state level, or at least I haven't come up with an idea how to do it, and maybe some others have. Today, I think we are seeing trends where a lot of people want to live downtown in walkable communities, and that means more attached housing and city centers and things. The pressure wasn't there in 1981 for that kind of housing, even though based on the paper of Goal 10, we were going, hey, you have to provide a lot of that, and a lot of that policy interpretation was usually about a city that projected they didn't need any land for that kind of thing, and LCDC and us saying, no, you really do, and here's all the reasoning we think you should provide it. But now, boy, I think there's a lot of market demand for that sort of thing, and you'd think that cities would be trying to do the infill, granny flats.
Right.
It's a big deal in providing a lot of opportunities. City of Salem still doesn't allow them at all. Eugene, so a whole different attitudes between sort of the regime in Salem about infill and granny flats. Very, very much, I'd say, an attitude of huge fights about just infill that's allowed under clear and objective standards. Whereas, you have other cities like Eugene and other Portland where they're encouraging a lot of infill. So the situation of infill, we weren't really talking about a lot about that in the early 80s, developing these policies, but it's a big issue today.
Right. So goal 10, goal 14, and goal 11, infrastructure to support development, but then goal 1.
Citizen involvement, yeah. Well, that's a whole nother discussion, and I've done a lot of work with goal 1. In my career, goal 10 was a big part of it at the beginning, but I touched, 15 other major policy areas, and often you would do that, touch them in a way that was changing or advancing or updating rules involving goal 11, involving goal 1. I've had a lot of projects like that, and so I have a broader understanding of what our policies require. But it's really difficult from where I sat to get a real good sense of how they're working on the ground. They're working differently everywhere. People will engage in cities throughout the state on housing issues because there's something being proposed next door or down the street, and then they will disengage, and the city could have a lot of well-advertised hearings on a new plan, and nobody would show up until it involved their neighborhood. And so it was always a difficult, again, very difficult sort of assumption in the early days of the program that there would be a robust state effort to require a lot of citizen involvement. It did happen. There were a lot of mechanisms to put them in place. They've sort of petered out, it's my sense. I staffed the state citizen involvement advisory committee for a period of time, starting in late 2011, 12, 13, 14, a lot of those years. And so I just because we were short-staffed at LCDC, I got a sense about a lot of their discussions, and generally same thing with housing. You had cities that were really locally interested and did a great job, and cities that really didn't have any money for it, didn't care much about it, wasn't an issue for them. They don't have any neighborhood organizations. That's always been just sort of made me pull up short when a city would say, we don't have any neighborhood organizations and we're not going to allow them. And then you have other cities where that's sort of the center of their planning world. So it's a pretty diverse world of citizen involvement. But housing issues will bring people in, sometimes in droves. There's been a lot of very public discussions about housing, certainly in Portland. We see them in the newspapers, and I do anyway, and certainly in the bigger cities, Corvallis and Eugene, where there's been a lot of development of infill and larger projects for student housing and for other kinds of housing, in the downtowns that involve infill to get everybody exercised, and a lot of debate. And then you've got a lot of smaller cities where they're not seeing any of that development, they're not having any arguments, and maybe they're not having any citizen involvement. I can't make that assertion, but certainly not to the same level over housing that you're seeing in the cities where there's a lot of things happening and a lot of pressure to change and bring in development or approve development or change the plans in order to encourage it. The policy for Goal 10 has to change to the extent that we've got to have new tools to help a lot of cities develop more modern zoning and planning ordinances where those local governments don't have any staff, they don't have any money. This is an era of city budgets that are just minuscule. And in the 80s, there was, for some reason, looking back, you forget about it. There was a lot of city planners. There was a lot of money that cities had to set up citizen involvement, to really look hard at housing that cities don't have today. So that in itself means, we're going to have to think about some ways to do things different.
Did you study with Dick Ragatz?
I did. Now, Dick Ragatz was a professor when I was at the University of Oregon planning program in the late 80s. And generally, Dick would get, as a consultant, would have projects that cities would hire him to do a housing plan or look at a particular project and that sort of thing. That was a time, for example, when there was a lot of money for those kinds of projects, and cities would be able to hire consultants to come in and do their housing plan.
Right.
And they still do that, but the dollars are shorter today than they were.
Right. But in 79, 80, his firm produced a housing planning manual for the state, which was in turn based on material that the Federal Housing Administration had produced, how to do housing market analysis, how to think about forecasting demand.
And a lot of that was redone, and maybe even twice. But that was all great work, and I probably should have mentioned that in my earlier comments. In addition to sort of development of the policy of Goal 10 and looking at how cities were implementing that with their planning, you had efforts to come up with materials and assistance to cities and counties on how do you do this, technical assistance. I guess you put that in a category. Yes, the manual, those manuals at various times are important, and I think right now there's an effort. Again, DLCD has a policy agenda every 2 years. So these are the things we're going to work on. Right. Now, the last time I took a look at that, I don't know where, they probably got a new one by now, but there was a especially called out as a project that the DLCD wants to focus on, and maybe is doing right now, coming up with more tools, assistance for local governments. I don't know how many cities there are that don't have a planner. They have a city recorder trying to carry out Goal 10. And so you can write tools for small cities, and we've had projects like that, I think successful projects. When you start dealing with the state giving technical assistance to large communities like Corvallis or Eugene, there's a disconnect there too, because those cities have far more resources than the department to come up with a lot of detailed research, tools, what's happening, what's not happening. And so it's probably more that middle area where a lot of hand-holding should happen between the state and the local governments, and then for the small communities where you really have a need for these materials. But then a lot of the crisis is happening at the larger cities, where I'm not sure how much impact it would have to develop a whole round of new assistance materials, such as that manual today, to help Eugene or Corvallis or Portland. Probably not something to spend a lot of time on, because they're going to be able on their own, or they've already been working on those kinds of things for a long time. But that's where the crises are happening in these larger developed communities, for a variety of reasons, and different reasons in Corvallis than in, say, Portland or Bakersfield or whatever.
Final thoughts?
Well, I hope I've said everything right now. I don't have any final thoughts. I think we're at a particular time where there's a sense of crisis in the news. There's a demand that the state help out and try to solve this housing crisis. And my thought is that probably the state will have a smaller role than they did in 1980 in trying to affect change on local governments to bring about more affordable housing. An awful lot of that solutions to those problems are going to be things that involve financing and public money and maybe some changes, major changes in the way we think about whether it's transportation, parking and a whole bunch of other things that are new and sort of less in the goal 10 realm than in the past. That isn't to say there isn't room for a rethink on the housing policy, and I think that's been underway. There's been committees talking about housing ideas for quite some time. I just do get the sense right now that I don't see any really great big ideas out there that really would work if only we could get the political will to solve them. I'm not talking out of school to say that I've had calls from people in the last year, saying, hey, give me some ideas for legislation. Because I think, there's a little bit of a struggle of how do we advance goal 10 right now to solve the housing problem where I think it's still a little bit of a mystery as to what to do. I might be wrong because I'm not at those meetings the last year or 2 years. So maybe there are some great ideas that are starting to be discussed, but I don't know about them.
Many of the things people are fighting about now, pretty similar to what people were fighting about back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Both at a technical level as well as at a more value-based level.
Yeah. So good. So I hope some of this program.
No, it's very important. Thank you very much.